Alex Deane, political commentator and consultant, is with us. Good to have you with us, Alex. I mean, I don't know what words we can find to talk about a story that just took in the last 15 minutes this horrific and fatal turn that we learn now that a child has died. But what we're not surprised about are people wielding knives in broad daylight.
Ian, you're right. It's absolutely appalling news. And I didn't know until you broke it just now that there had been this child fatality. But I'm afraid in your opening, you were right. These images are starting to lose their power to shock because it is relatively frequent. If you remember our national reaction, quite rightly, when Lee Rigby was murdered in broad daylight on the streets in our country, that's the reaction we should have every time.
Correct.
Because it should be so unusual and so outlandish, in addition to just being so straight appalling, that it makes us all sit up and listen. And instead, we now see this very frequently. And you were asking your listeners, how did we get here? Well, there's one interesting thing from last week. In the debates for who's going to be our next mayor of London, the incumbent Sadiq Khan was asked by the Conservative candidate Susan Hall, what are we doing about this epidemic of machete carrying? And he said to her, you've got to stop watching The Wire. You know, it's Tory candidates just not living in reality. Well, I'm afraid this is our reality. Machetes are now, and swords are now increasingly common. Yeah. That guy was carrying a sword and he felt not one moment of uncertainty about what he was going to do. And it was clear that this was not something for him that felt out of the norm. This wasn't something he felt embarrassed by. Striding down the street, having taken lives, it should be profoundly shocking. And the worst thing of all is that increasingly, it's not.
Yeah. And we mentioned that word, I said at the beginning, about emboldened and feeling, and you just touched on it there as well, Alex, feeling almost casually relaxed about the idea. I don't know how many times you look at Twitter or TikTok and see these images of kids and others up and down the streets holding blades. They must know they're being filmed. You can't walk down a big street anywhere without somebody holding a camera, CCTV on a lamppost, or a Ring doorbell filming your every moment. That anyone out there knows they're going to be seen. But the brazen nature of this, the way we've kind of resigned ourselves to it, it's almost, I wouldn't go as far as say it's the new normal, but it's fast approaching that.
Well, Ian, part of me wonders if being filmed and being photographed is what they want.
Yeah.
And it rewards this behaviour. But I think there's two things. The first is the brazen nature of it, which you're right about. The second is you hope, you believe, you expect that will change when the police are there. Instead, in the footage that you have been showing and that people have seen, when that man sees the police, he doesn't flinch, he doesn't drop his weapon, he doesn't turn away. He's completely comfortable with their presence. And this is part of the problem. That should have been a bright line divide. The moment that the police are there, the criminal should be alarmed for his own security, safety, and should be cowed into compliance. Instead, they enter into this sort of negotiation with this guy, waving a sword around on the street, having taken life. The police should be reassuring for the law-abiding and pretty terrifying for the law-breaking, and certainly for the violent law-breaking like this guy. Instead, it's clear they don't care about the police. They're not afraid of them one bit.
Absolutely. We are going to come back to this story, of course. Let's just look at some of the other big headlines, disturbing for other reasons as well. This one I could have written last year or the year before, or even the year before that. I'm sure you could have done as well. The Home Office have lost some migrants. Who would have thought that was even possible when 50,000 people a year come unchecked into your country?
So there's a couple of basic problems with this one. And the first point is for us to admit something. Someone might have the most bogus claim to asylum or refugee status going. It's still not their fault that we take so long to process them. That's our fault. That's down to us. We can process faster, refuse faster, and then seek to deport faster. The arguments with the recipient country, sending them back and so forth, that's down to us too. But what we can have control over is how quickly we process people. And the reason I mention that is the longer we take, the more likely it is that somebody goes walkies from these facilities, which are, after all, not secure, They're not detained. They're not prisoners for month after month. And I think we've got it very wrong in not going through things very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about this, Alex, is that these are people that they'd apparently earmarked for the initial, Takeoff to Rwanda scheme, which none of us are confident is really going to happen, or it does, not in any significant way. So clearly the people got wind of the fact that it might be us, so we better run, and they have.
Well, I mean, what a surprise that these are the people most likely to take to their heels, the people who've been earmarked for deportation to Rwanda already. I demur from your view on one thing, which is it's clear from the number of asylum seekers and refugees who apparently are going to Ireland from the United Kingdom, that the Rwanda scheme is having some effect already. Some people are thinking, well, rather than being sent to Rwanda, I'd rather stay in Europe, and therefore I'm going to take my chances in Ireland. It's quite funny, isn't it? Because when we try to send people back to France, Ian, we're told it's unreasonable, unlawful, impossible. When the Irish want to return people to us, it's lawful, reasonable, possible.
Yes.
I mean, the hypocrisy is alarming, but I don't want to let us off the hook too lightly here. We should be devoting significant resource, especially once someone's been refused leave to remain and is going to be sent back to another country, or indeed sent to Rwanda. It's down to us to detain them and then send them as soon as possible. And we've now got a new job, which is to find where these people are as soon as possible, round them up and ship them off.
Indeed. Let's look at another story here. The woes for the SNP continue. Humza Yousaf remains, of course, in power until a replacement is found. But of course, all of this is playing nicely into the hands of opposition parties, but in particular Labour, who are going to be the chief beneficiaries of SNP woes, it seems. Their star is rising and the SNP's is down the pan, frankly.
Well, we're going to see some funny things happen, I think, electorally north of the border. And actually, I think all of the unionist parties are likely to benefit. We may see some uptick in Conservative support north of the border too. But you are right. Labour will look to be the most significant single party to gain from it. My position on this, and I'm a card-carrying Tory, my position may be regarded as unusual or unfashionable, but the first priority for me is always our country. And I believe in the Union of the United Kingdom. And I rejoice in the collapse of the SNP. I regard it as significantly overdue on performance grounds. Terrible government, terrible health outcomes north of the border, appalling policies on things like prisons, trying to put men in women's prisons, and so forth. And this is richly overdue. Any unionist party benefiting from it, I celebrate. But I will just say this, Ian. The surprise that Humza Yousaf seems to say he's got just tells you how bad a First Minister he was. He went into coalition with the Greens. The Greens' position has not changed one bit. He dumped the Greens from his coalition and is then surprised, apparently, that he doesn't have a majority anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, the fact that he didn't work that out beforehand kind of almost disqualifies him from office, I would suggest.
Yeah, the ability to count is a pretty basic element. That's what it gave him his majority.
This was like sixth form stuff. Anyone could have worked this out, but apparently not him. Final story, briefly if we can, Alex. Sex is a biological fact. Who knew? Here's some breaking news. Sex is a biological fact, everybody. The NHS are saying this in a landmark shift against some of the more wacky gender ideology. What are your thoughts on that?
The disappointment is that it is a landmark shift. It never should have been like this. NHS guidance, which I've reviewed and discussed on programmes like yours about chest feeders instead of women who are breastfeeding, or people who bleed for guidance over periods instead of women and girls. It was all junk. We always knew it. The emperor had no clothes. And the fact that we went along with it to an extent is, shame on us.
Indeed. Alex, as ever, thank you. Alex Deane, political commentator with us here on talkTV.